life and the narrow way. Go to the next slide. This is a familiar passage. It's from Matthew 7:13 and 14. And Jesus says this, it's all part of the Sermon on the Mount, which covers sort of chapters 5, 6, 7 of Matthew. And Jesus says, enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. And this will be a familiar passage to many people. Probably even people in the world know this type of passage, a narrow way and a broad way. And the traditional view of this is the wide way is sort of the way that leads to hell, to destruction, separation from God, and the narrow way is the way that leads to wonderful eternal life and happiness and all those great things. And can be separated out into Christian and non-Christian, basically, believer and unbeliever. But actually, that's probably the wrong approach to this passage. You have to know who the audience is, who is Jesus talking to understand who this is applicable to. If we go to the next slide, and we go back right to, actually it should be Matthew 5, 1 and 2. Right at the very beginning, before he starts the Sermon on the Mount. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Then notice the next bit, his disciples came to him and he began to teach them. He began to teach them. So whatever follows is basically teaching to the disciples. The crowds are listening to what he says, because right at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, the crowds respond to one another and say, well, who is like this man? He speaks with such amazing authority. He doesn't speak like our religious people. He speaks with authority. He speaks with conviction. And no doubt the crowds were listening to him. But the thing to realize about the Sermon on the Mount is predominantly it is to disciples. It's to those who followed him. And if you start looking at it that way, you begin to see a new spin on those two verses. If we look at other passages that occur in the Sermon on the Mount, you'll begin to see why it's addressed to disciples. What Jesus says doesn't fit the crowd. It does fit the disciples. So if we go to the next slide, these are just sort of a random few verses taken out of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Now, he wouldn't be saying that to those who didn't believe in him. They wouldn't be calling him Lord anyway. The only people that would call him or supposedly call him Lord are those who are his supposed followers. And yet Jesus says here, not everyone who calls me Lord, Lord will get into the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is quite scathing of those who call him Lord, Lord and don't mean it in sincerity or don't mean it the right way. He says, well, I never knew you. Depart from me. Go away. Matthew 6:7, Jesus says, and when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. You know, he wouldn't be addressing people who aren't praying. Those who don't follow him and don't believe in him wouldn't pray to him. So he's addressing people who pray. Even there, he makes a bit of a distinction, you know, between those who pray and those who babble like pagans. And then in Matthew 5:13 and 14, he says, you are the salt of the earth. He wouldn't be addressing unbelievers. He would not be addressing those who weren't following him. because he wouldn't call non-believers the salt of the earth. It's got to be addressed to believers, or supposed believers, because this whole passage on the Sermon on the Mount does raise some intriguing questions. And then he says, you are the light of the world. Well, again, he wouldn't be saying that to the general crowd. I say the crowd are listening, but they're sort of listening, they're not the main people that Jesus is addressing. He's actually addressing his disciples. And don't forget, this isn't just the 12, because he does have another 70 recorded as his followers. So I don't think this is just the 12, I think this is those who are following him. And we know from other events in Jesus' life that people do turn back from following him. We've looked at, I think it's John chapter 6, where he talks about himself being the bread of life. And he says, those who don't feed on me, or he talks about those who feed on him. And many, at the end of that chapter, can't get what he's saying. And they, how can you say that? We don't go with it. We're leaving. And so, we go to the next slide. We go back to this Matthew 7:13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction. Many find that road. Many find it. But Jesus says, small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. We've been talking a lot about life, and the word life in here is the word Zoe in the Greek. It's the life as God has it, so this is what Jesus is talking about. This road that you can find will lead to this Zoe life, and he says only a few will ever find that life. Many will find the other road. It's interesting when you start looking at gate, and I thought, well, what's the biblical connotation about a gate? What's the New Testament gate? And it's very easy to sort of think that Jesus is the gate. You might sort of go to John 10, where it talks about the gate of the sheepfold. Actually, Jesus is never referred to as a gate, and he never refers to himself as a gate. In John 10, the actual correct translation is really door, and that's the way the King James Version does it. But the Greek word here for gate is never applied to Jesus. So Jesus is not the gate. You may ask me, well, what or who is the gate? I have no idea. No idea. One of many questions I had on this passage, I asked the Lord, and he said, silence. Does happen. So I don't have all the answers to this passage. I'm as much a seeker as you are. And I think there is a particular sort of a reason, which I'll probably come to later, as to why things are hidden. It'll become obvious later. But obviously in here we've got this thing, the road that leads to life, the way, I think is the way the King James has it. And we've got this word life. Well, if we go to the next passage, next slide, Jesus does say this about himself. He says, I am the way, the truth, and I am the life. So I think there is a connection between the road, the way that Jesus talked about in Sermon on the Mount, the narrow way, and it leading to life. And I think there's probably a connection between him and that road, because he is definitely called the life, and he is definitely called the way. We go to the next slide. We're looking here at two distinct roads, two distinct ways. We're looking at a wide way, and we're looking at a narrow way. And I thought it would be interesting to look at, well, what can we learn from these two different roads? One is wide. Well, the thing about a wide way is that you can have people aside you, as in the diagram there. But in the narrow way, it's just you. And the word that's used for the narrow way is the Greek for narrow in that passage means to crowd in. And it literally means to be sort of almost compacted. You can't move on that narrow way. You are constricted. You are restrained from what you can do. And that becomes quite important, I think. We'll look at the next slide and see what happens. But with this particular one, to me, what it shows is ultimately the Christian life of the narrow way is a relationship between you and the Lord. I've known Christians who, if they don't have other Christians around them for support, when challenging times come, they crumble. However, what Jesus is looking for is a person who can be on that narrow way, constricted, but has such a relationship with him that it doesn't cause any problems. Such is their commitment to the Lord, such is their relationship with the Lord. You may have people in front and you may have people behind, but it's not like the wide way where you can have people to the side of you, more sort of like a group going down the road. Jesus isn't looking for a group going down the road. He's looking for individuals walking down the road, and it's the individual's relationship with the Lord that is important. As I say, if you can't establish your relationship with the Lord on your own and do it in the narrow way, you will come a cropper in your faith at some point. You'll come unstuck. Because if you're relying on the support of others, fellowship is obviously good and meeting together is good, but you do need to cultivate a relationship with the Lord that when all else around you fails, you still stand. That is an incredibly important aspect of the Christian life, and I've come across Christians who just crumble when there's no Christian support around them. They just go to pieces. You have to cultivate this individual walk with the Lord, and the narrow way shows that, because it's just you at that point. And that is a good place to be. And I think when Jesus taught about the narrow way, this was an aspect he had in mind. Jesus was obviously a very sort of indicative of that, because at the end of his life, everybody around him fell away from him. Had nothing to do with him, really, denied him or run away from him. It was him, but his relationship with his Father was such, he stood. And you do actually see that in the life of Paul. I can't remember where it is, but he talks about many people deserted me, and it was just me standing alone. But he said God supported me, the Lord supported me. And you do, if you want to have the life as God has it, as God wants us to have, you will have to learn to stand individually in your relationship with the Lord. We go to the next slide. What else do we learn? Well, the thing about a person being on the broad way is that you can look in various directions. And not only can you look in various directions, you can actually walk in various directions. You don't necessarily have to walk straight up the middle of the wide way. In fact, actually, if you've ever tried walking straight up sort of a pathway or whatever with your eyes closed, you'll find you deviate. And on a wide road, you can deviate. You can walk to the right, and then you can walk straight, and then you might walk to the left a bit, and then you can meander up the wide road. And your vision, you can be looking to the side, you can be looking there, you can be looking there, you can be looking there, you can be looking at people who are there. And you can move in that direction, you can move to the side. But the person who's on the narrow way, if you look at that, they can't move to the side. And I think that's why Jesus talks about the narrow way. You're not to move to the side. You're not even to look to the side. A person who is on that narrow way can only look and move straight ahead. And interestingly enough, a person on the wide way, they can sort of meander down the road. And they will probably get where they're going eventually, but they'll do it quite slowly. The straight, narrow, constricted road is actually the quickest road, because you can't go to the side, you can only go forward. And I think this is what Jesus had in mind, that there's a person on the narrow road has a focus ahead of them. They're going straight, they know where they're going. And they have this individual relationship with the Lord where they are certain of where they're going. And I think this is what Jesus is trying to get across to the people, to his disciples, his followers. You see, because he's addressing his followers, it is possible for a Christian to meander, for his followers to meander. And that's not what he's looking for. He's looking for people who have a direct approach, looking straight forward, want to make progress as quickly as possible. I won't say that this doesn't raise quite a lot of questions, and I don't have the answers. All I'm trying to do is just sort of present these verses and perhaps get us to think a bit more about them. How do you know which road you're on? Can you change roads? Don't know. Questions. But this is Jesus' teaching, and no wonder the disciples at times were confused, because I can identify them and I think, well, I'm pretty confused at times with some of the things the Lord says. I'll rephrase that, with many of the things the Lord says. But he says it for a reason. As I say, this narrow way, the Greek word for the narrow there is to be crowded in upon, is to be constrained, to be almost like you're being crushed. And there is quite an interesting verse. If we go to the next slide. This is what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 4, 8 and 9. He says, we are hard pressed on every side, crowded in upon. But notice what he says, but we're not crushed. And then he goes on to say, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. And this is the interesting thing about when we can be pressed and compressed from the sides. Actually, those who are standing true in the Lord won't feel they are being crushed. There'll be pressure, but no crushing. That doesn't make a lot of sense in the natural. You think if you crush something, if you push it in, it's going to crush. But here Paul, and he sort of says it in different phrases, but it's very similar in what he says. It's like there's a pressure on us, things are happening to us, but we're not down and out. We're surviving what's going on. And one gets a feeling from Paul's life that not only did he survive, he flourished. There was that ability that when everything was really pressing him, the power of God was so strong in him, almost pushing out. No, God is stronger in me than what is pressing me in on the side. We go to the next slide. Slide 10, I think. Enter through the narrow gate. Wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction. And many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life. And Jesus, by his own words, says only a few are going to find that road. Only a few are going to travel it. And remember who he's addressing. He's addressing his followers. And effectively what he's saying to them, he said, out of you, only a few of you are actually going to find life. Only a few of you are going to find this way, this narrow way. It's quite interesting. If you think about all the disciples Jesus had, what happened to them? Well, we hear a lot about John and we hear a lot about Peter. But what about people like Andrew, Peter's brother? We never hear of him past the Gospels, and I don't think he even appears in Acts. Thaddeus. Do you remember him outside of the Gospels? Levi. What happens to them? They were a very disparate band of people. Some go on to be leaders of churches. But some, what happens to them? We don't know. There's no record. But Jesus says only a few find it. If you ask the question, well, where is this road? How do I get to it? Paul, tell me, how do we get to this road? Where is it? Point me in a direction. Can't do it. And there's a clue here as to why. And it's in the word find. You have to be somebody who wants to find it. You have to be a finder. And this fits in quite well, because if we go to the next slide, this is a few verses earlier in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, and the one who knocks, the door will be opened. If you want to find the way, you have to take on board Jesus' words from slightly earlier. You have to seek, and then you will find. But you have to be a seeker. If you want to travel that path, if you want to travel that narrow way, if you want to know the life that way gives you, you're going to have to seek, and you're going to have to find it. And this couples with the next slide, which is Jeremiah 29:13. We're very aware probably of Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. What may not be known is the verse that occurs 2 verses later. It's this one. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. If you want to find the narrow way, you've got to be committed to finding it. You've got to seek. God promises you will find, but you have to seek. And I think this is why very little is given about the narrow way, is where it is or how you get to it, because the onus is on each one of us to find it. I can't find it for you, and you can't find it for me. You're going to have to find it on your own. You're going to have to find that narrow way. You're going to have to seek for it. Going off at a slight tangent, but when Jesus was talking about the narrow gate, going through it, there's a word there that's used, and it's the word straight, S-T-R-A-I-T. And it's interesting that word only occurs 3 times in the New Testament. It occurs twice in Matthew 7:13 and 14. But this is the other place it occurs. So if we go to the next slide. It's in Luke 13:24-25. Jesus says this, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to. And that word for narrow there, as I say, it's the word straight, which occurs in Matthew 7:13 and 14. Make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to. Once the owner of the house gets up and closes the door, you will stand outside knocking and pleading, Sir, open the door for us. But he will answer, I don't know you or where you come from. If you look at the first part of that, it says, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because many, I tell you, will try to enter and will not be able to, full stop. And you ask yourself the question, well, if they're making all the effort to enter through the door, why can't they enter? They want to, they're making the effort. Then the next sentence says, once the owner of the house gets up and closes the door, you will stand outside knocking and pleading. So one gets a bit of an indication, oh, well, maybe the door's shut. If we go to a different version, go to the next slide. This comes from the CSB version of the Bible. It does become clearer because it says, make every effort to enter through the narrow door, because I tell you, many will try to enter and won't be able. And then it continues the sentence, once the homeowner gets up and shuts the door. So there we know from that version that the reason they can't enter is because they've left it too late. The door is now shut in their face. We go to the next slide. We now have the comparison of those two passages. And this was something that Brian brought up in house group recently, and I found it quite fascinating. And it's something worth bearing in mind when you look at the Bible. So all credit to Brian for coming up with this. What's Paul going to say? And it's the fact in the original Greek there is no punctuation. Full stops are put in according to the way people think they should be put in. It's all, Greek scholars sort of think, well, the full stop goes there, or the full stop might go there. It's not that easy. I mean, people who know the Greek think, oh yeah, that's a sentence break there. But if you know that there's no punctuation in the Greek, and you come across passages like this, it's worth bearing in mind that actually, well, maybe there's a bit of a continuation from one train of thought, one sentence, into the next sentence. Maybe that full stop is causing a few problems. And notice here in the NIV, it's split. It puts a full stop after will not be able to, and then it starts a new sentence once the owner of the house gets up and closes the door. Whereas with the CSB version, you get make every effort to enter through the narrow door. Because I tell you, many will try to enter and won't be able once the house owner gets up and shuts the door. I would recommend when you read the Bible, you do find different versions, that you look across different versions, because they can sort of give a different indication as to what's going on. But at the end of the day, this is about the narrow way. It's about the way that the Lord wants us to travel. He wants us to go along that narrow road, that narrow way. Because that's the way he says that leads to life. That's the way of life. It's the road of life. It's a narrow way of life. This passage may raise questions in your mind. You may say, well, I don't know about that or this. You literally are going to have to go away, and you are going to have to seek and find on this. Because Jesus actually tells you that's what you've got to do. Very few will find the narrow way, but you do, if you want it, you're going to have to find it. You're going to have to seek it. Because it's a way of life, and that's where life is found. If you feel that your life is, empty, and Christians can feel empty in their lives. I've come across Christians who, they don't feel that they have got what God wants them to have. Well, I'd encourage you, if you're in that position, seek the narrow way, because it is the way of life. Jesus said that he was the way and the life. Amen.